The gavel slammed down in a cramped Chicago courtroom, and a tense hush fell upon every soul in the gallery. No one there would ever forget the day the honorable, yet notoriously harsh, Judge Victor Harlan prepared to sentence 17-year-old Jamal Hale, a black teen accused of a robbery gone wrong. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed the judge was biased. Others swore the teen was no angel. Yet beneath the surface of this allegedly open and shut case lay a secret so shocking that it would tilt the scales of justice off their axis. No one saw it coming, especially not Judge Harlan. The early morning sun peeked over the high-rises of downtown Chicago, its rays filtering through the tall windows of the Cook County Courthouse. Inside, people bustled about, attorneys clutching thick case files as they made their way to their respective courtrooms. On that chilly morning, the docket was crammed with a range of cases from minor traffic violations to more serious felonies. In courtroom 14B, the air was particularly heavy. Judge Victor Harlan, known for his stern demeanor and strict sentencing, sat perched on the bench, a steely expression cemented on his face. His salt-and-pepper hair was cropped short, but beneath his robe, his broad shoulders and commanding presence gave him an air of unquestionable authority. Observers whispered that he showed little mercy to defendants, especially young, marginalized individuals who came from tough neighborhoods. That morning, 17-year-old Jamal Hale stood at the defendant's table, wrists trembling slightly as he awaited his turn. He was tall for his age, with a lean frame that spoke of nights spent running around the local basketball courts. Jamal lived on the South Side with his grandmother, who had fallen ill over the past year. The care for his grandmother and the daily grind to survive in an underfunded neighborhood weighed on his adolescent shoulders. But that day it was an entirely different kind of burden he faced, the burden of a possible conviction. Across the aisle, the prosecution team, led by Assistant State's Attorney Lena Vargas, organized their notes meticulously. They were determined to paint Jamal as a dangerous criminal. In their eyes, or at least in the narrative they were pushing, Jamal was the prime suspect in a burglary at a local electronics store, an incident that involved a scuffle with a security guard. Though no one had been gravely injured, the guard's bruised ribs and a broken window told a tale of violence. As Jamal's court-appointed attorney, Isaiah Cruz, attempted to steady him, the teen's heart pounded like a bass drum. With every reverberating thump, he wondered if his entire life was about to derail. He had tried to explain to Cruz that he had an alibi, he was working a part-time shift at the local grocery store, and that he had never set foot in the electronics shop that night. Yet the evidence, albeit circumstantial, pointed in his direction. A partial fingerprint, a witness who claimed to have seen a tall black teen fleeing the scene, and Jamal's own admission that he once visited that same store a few weeks prior. Nevertheless, Jamal's pleas of innocence echoed in his attorney's notes. Cruz clung to every detail Jamal provided, hoping to prove the teen's story. What no one in that courtroom realized yet was that a thunderous secret threatened to overturn everything they believed about Jamal Hale, and that fate itself was orchestrating a massive reckoning for Judge Harlan. Before the trial began, Judge Harlan took a moment to scan the courtroom. His brown eyes lingered over Jamal's family members, who sat in the gallery. Jamal's grandmother in a wheelchair, looking frail yet determined, her gray hair in a neat bun, her eyes swimming with worry. Jamal's cousin, a college student who had taken the bus early that morning to be there, and a few of Jamal's neighbors who had known him since he was small. At the back sat strangers and casual spectators drawn by the rumor that a high-stakes case involving alleged racial bias was unfolding. Jamal noticed the way Judge Harlan's gaze hardened the moment he laid eyes on him. It was subtle, but it was enough to make Jamal's pulse race. Judge Harlan's record spoke volumes. He was not one to back down from handing out severe sentences, especially to individuals from underprivileged communities. There had been rumblings among public defenders that Harlan had a disproportionately high sentencing rate for black youths compared to white defendants who had committed comparable offenses. The rumor had never been proven, but it lingered, fueling an atmosphere thick with tension. The prosecution opened with a succinct yet damning statement. They portrayed Jamal as a teen who had grown resentful of his family's financial struggles and decided to rob the store, expecting to make a quick profit. They called it a calculated assault. Meanwhile, Isaiah Cruz tried to counter with the fact that Jamal was known as a helpful neighbor, a volunteer at a community center, and a young man who had never before been in trouble with the law. Judge Harlan leaned forward, scrutinizing every exhibit and piece of testimony. From time to time, a tight frown creased his forehead. Jamal's eyes flickered toward the exit, longing for a quick escape. But there was no running away from a trial that was quickly spiraling beyond his control. Worse, he had this gnawing feeling that no matter what was said, the judge had already made up his mind. Yet, as the tension rose inside the courtroom, an undercurrent of something else began to brew. Something intangible, like an unspoken rumor or an unacknowledged truth. Several times throughout the morning's proceedings, Cruz glanced at Jamal with a quizzical look. It was as though the lawyer suspected there was more to his client's story, but Jamal seemed reticent, as if he believed revealing too much about himself could do more harm than good. Regardless, neither of them knew just how explosive the hidden details would prove to be. As the days of the trial unfolded, witness after witness paraded through the stand. The store owner recounted discovering the shattered window, hearing a struggle, and calling the police. The security guard, wearing a brace around his torso, described chasing a tall male figure out the front door. He admitted it was dark and that he got only a glance at the intruder's face. However, he stated he was pretty sure it was Jamal, not sounding entirely confident. When Isaiah Cruz cross-examined the guard, he pointed out inconsistencies in the guard's account of the suspect's height, clothing, and facial features. Though the guard insisted he remembered enough, his voice wavered whenever Cruz pressed for specifics. Still, Jamal could feel the judge's skeptical gaze each time the prosecution tabled a piece of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution laid out the fingerprint evidence, which was partial at best, a smear on the window frame that matched part of Jamal's left thumb. Cruz countered by bringing up Jamal's own explanation. Jamal said he had pressed his hand against that same window once to look at a new video game console that had been displayed in the store's window. He insisted that the partial print was from weeks earlier. Meanwhile, in the gallery, Jamal's grandmother clasped her bony hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could not stand the sight of her grandson in an orange jumpsuit. She prayed silently, hoping that the Lord would guide both the attorney and the judge to see reason. Yet the more the trial progressed, the more Jamal felt as though an invisible noose was tightening around his future. By the close of the first week, the proceedings had become the talk of local media outlets. Although there were far more sensational cases in Chicago, something about the dynamic and unwavering judge, a marginalized defendant, the rumor of bias, caught the attention of advocates from civil rights organizations. A representative from the local chapter of the NAACP even took a seat at the back of the courtroom, scribbling notes with each new development. And behind all that swirl of tension lay the unspoken truth that Jamal was desperately trying to keep hidden. He had never told his attorney the full story of how he had spent his childhood or the real circumstances of his father's disappearance. He had his reasons, deep personal and possibly life-altering reasons for keeping his past sealed away. But like a dormant volcano, secrets of that magnitude rarely remain quiet forever. All it would take was one slip, one clue uncovered, and everything could come undone in the most public and dramatic way possible. Isaiah Cruz sensed something amiss. One evening, after a grueling day in court, he sat in his cramped office reviewing Jamal's case file once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that his young client was holding something back. Jamal had insisted from day one that he was innocent, and Cruz believed him. It wasn't just the typical attorney's loyalty to a client. There was a clarity in Jamal's eyes whenever he talked about the incident, a combination of fear and honesty that suggested he was genuinely telling the truth about not being involved. Cruz typed away on his laptop, doing a deep dive into any public records he could find about Jamal, his family, and any past legal or medical documents. What he found was surprisingly sparse. A single mention of Jamal's father, Darius Hale, in a legal dispute from years earlier. Some school records indicating Jamal had excellent attendance until a certain point in middle school, then a sharp decline before rebounding in high school, and a meager footprint of Jamal's volunteer activities. Nothing seemed damning. If anything, it showed Jamal as a kid who had faced real hardships, his father's unknown whereabouts, his mother's passing in a tragic car accident years prior, yet had managed to stay out of serious trouble. Still, the puzzle felt incomplete. Cruz picked up his phone and called a private investigator friend. "I need you to see if there's anything else out there about Jamal's family," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Medical records, old legal disputes, anything that might not be in the usual databases." Over the phone, the investigator agreed to dig deeper. Cruz knew time was running short. The trial was hitting its midpoint, and if they didn't come up with something more concrete to debunk the prosecution's case, Jamal's future would be in jeopardy. Across town, Jamal sat on a thin mattress in a juvenile detention cell, turning the situation over and over in his mind. He felt torn between two forms of desperation, one to prove his innocence, the other to keep his past locked away. He didn't want to talk about the lost years of his childhood or his father's mysterious final words to him, because it might lead to revelations that Jamal believed would only harm him. If the truth got out, would it help exonerate him, or would it spell disaster? He pressed his forehead against the cold bars, letting the chill ground him. Every night he replayed the day's courtroom drama, Judge Harlan's stern lectures, the prosecution's barbs, his grandmother's tearful eyes. He pictured the store's shattered window and the security guard's uncertain face. It all felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Little did Jamal know that events were already in motion to pull the curtain back on his past, dragging him and everyone else in that courtroom into a whirlwind of revelations. Midway through the second week of the trial, proceedings took an unexpected turn. The private investigator Cruz hired delivered a thick envelope of documents shortly before the trial resumed. Inside were pages of medical records from Jamal's infancy, records that contained cryptic notes about repeated hospital visits and a single phrase that made Cruz's eyes widen in shock. "Birth father not found. Potential half-sibling incarcerated." Adrenaline raced through Cruz's veins. He discreetly passed the folder to Jamal, flipping to the relevant page. Jamal's face paled. He stared at the notation, a swirl of emotions crossing his features: fear, confusion, and maybe even a flicker of resignation. With trembling hands, he slid the file back to Cruz, shaking his head wordlessly. When court resumed, the prosecution called a detective who had analyzed the footprints found near the store window. The detective claimed the shoes could be the same brand and size Jamal wore. Under normal circumstances, it was flimsy evidence, but combined with everything else, it added another layer of suspicion in the minds of the jury. Once the detective left the stand, Cruz requested a sidebar. Approaching the bench, he spoke in hushed tones to the judge and prosecution. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light that may be critical to the defendant's case. I request a brief recess to review it and potentially introduce it." Judge Harlan frowned deeply, his jaw clenching. "I hope this is not a delay tactic, Mr. Cruz. You're already treading on thin ice with these last-minute motions. I'll grant you 1 hour." As soon as the recess was declared, Cruz led Jamal into a private conference room, shutting the door behind them. Before he could speak, Jamal blurted out, "Mr. Cruz, please. There are some things about my father, about my family, that I just can't talk about. If this comes out, I'm not sure how it will help anything." Cruz's eyes softened. "Jamal, I understand you want to protect yourself, but we're fighting for your future here. If there's something in your background that can prove you had no motive or that you weren't even physically capable of this crime, we need to consider it." Jamal sighed, staring at the floor. He took a long moment as if debating how much to share. Finally, he inhaled deeply and spoke in a low voice. "My dad used to be someone else, someone important. He left when I was a baby. There was an accident. People died. There was talk about changing identities. Cruz blinked in disbelief. That's quite the revelation, but how does this connect to this robbery? Jamal shrugged helplessly. I don't know if it does. I just know that if the truth comes out about who I really am, or where I come from, it might ruin me more than any sentence could. People will look at me differently. They might hate me for it. Cruz wanted to press for more details, but time was short. The hour of recess was ticking away. He laid a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. Let me do some more digging, okay? We'll figure out the best way to handle this. But you have to trust me. Inside, Jamal felt torn to pieces. He nodded slowly, unable to fully commit to sharing it all. He couldn't predict the bombshell that was about to land in open court. While the second week of the trial progressed, an undercurrent of gossip rippled through the courthouse staff. It was no secret that Judge Harlan was under investigation by certain civil rights groups for alleged discriminatory sentencing. The word was that the Innocence Project had filed a request for data to see if Harlan's rulings reflected bias. Thus far, the judge had maintained his innocence, but the tension was building. Unknown to most, Judge Harlan had his own complicated past. Raised in a conservative household, he had initially joined the bench with aspirations of being a fair, impartial arbiter of the law. Over time, however, personal tragedies and the pressures of an overloaded legal system wore down his empathy. Rumors circulated that one of Harlan's children had been mugged by a group of teenagers years ago, sparking his harsh stance toward youthful offenders. On the day the rumor spread that the Innocence Project was officially investigating Harlan, the judge appeared even more rigid in the courtroom. He cut off Cruz's questions more frequently, sustained the prosecution's objections, and shot disapproving glances at Jamal whenever the teen so much as coughed. From the gallery, Jamal's grandmother pressed her lips together, whispering prayers while she clutched her rosary. She could sense something dark in the air, as though an invisible hand was tipping the scales against her grandson. Near the end of the second week, a new figure arrived in court. Reverend Elias Phelps, a long-standing civil rights activist known for championing the cause of wrongfully accused individuals. He had worked with the NAACP and had ties to the Innocence Project. The balding, respected Reverend was well known in Chicago for rallying resources to defend young people trapped in the legal system. Reverend Phelps took a seat next to Jamal's family, quietly observing the proceedings. During a recess, he introduced himself to Cruz, shaking the attorney's hand firmly. I've been following the case closely in the papers, the Reverend said. I believe this young man deserves a fair chance. Cruz nodded, explaining that they had uncovered some peculiarities in Jamal's background. He hesitated, unsure how much to share, but eventually confided in the Reverend that Jamal had a secret that might sway public opinion if it ever came to light. The Reverend raised his eyebrows but did not pry. Instead, he offered, whatever it is, Isaiah, remember that truth is a double-edged sword. But if this boy is innocent, the truth can set him free. That afternoon, Reverend Phelps accompanied Jamal's grandmother to the cafeteria while the trial resumed. She confided in him about Jamal's father, how he was once a promising athlete who vanished after being falsely implicated in a tragic accident. She recounted how she feared Jamal would suffer the same injustice. The Reverend listened intently, his heart heavy for this family's struggle. He vowed to speak with the Innocence Project if the tide turned unfavorably. The next day, the prosecution presented a piece of CCTV footage from a camera located a block away from the electronics store. It showed a figure sprinting down an alley around the time of the robbery, wearing a dark hoodie. Though the figure's face was shrouded in shadow, the prosecution insisted it was Jamal, citing the height and general build. Isaiah Cruz stood to cross-examine the detective presenting the footage. Detective, you testified earlier that the suspect in the footage appears to be approximately 6 feet tall with a slim build. Can you confirm the exact height measurement? The detective hesitated. It's approximate. We use the height of a lamppost in the background for scale. Cruz clicked a remote, pausing the video. And was the camera's angle accounted for in your measurement? The detective shifted uncomfortably. We did our best, but it's not an exact science, Cruz pressed on. So, in essence, this footage does not irrefutably confirm the person running is my client, correct? Not conclusively, the detective admitted. Judge Harlan arched an eyebrow but refrained from any comment. The jury wore expressions of mild confusion. The footage was grainy, and the person running could be almost anyone of similar build. Still, the prosecution hammered home that Jamal had a motive and was in the vicinity. Never mind that his purported alibi was that he'd been at work. The grocery store manager had testified that Jamal left his shift slightly early, but the exact time was unclear. If there was any window of possibility, the prosecution seized it. That night, back in juvenile detention, Jamal lay awake on the bunk, the flickering fluorescent light humming overhead. He kept replaying the detective's words and the CCTV footage in his mind. His spirit felt weighed down by a sense of doom. The piling evidence, though still largely circumstantial, could sway a jury, especially under the guiding hand of a judge inclined to see him as guilty. Jamal closed his eyes, recalling an old memory, his father's voice, low and urgent, telling him, "Don't ever let them see who you really are." He had been a small boy then, maybe 5 or 6, but he remembered the intense look in his father's eyes. At the time, he didn't understand what it meant, but now it all made sense. There was a reason for anonymity, for slipping under the radar. But how far was Jamal willing to protect that reason if it meant risking his freedom? In his heart, Jamal wanted to come clean to Cruz, to let the attorney piece together the puzzle of his father's identity and the hidden circumstances of his own birth. Perhaps it would shed light on how Jamal ended up here, or prove that he had no reason to commit this crime. However, Jamal couldn't shake the fear that unveiling these secrets would generate a media storm, overshadowing the case and painting him in an even stranger light. Nonetheless, time was running out. If he didn't act soon, the worst-case scenario would become reality, a guilty verdict and a merciless sentence from Judge Harlan. That thought alone made Jamal feel colder than any jail cell's concrete walls ever could. As the third week of the trial began, just as tensions neared a breaking point, Isaiah Cruz called an unexpected witness, a nurse from a hospital in Evanston, where Jamal was allegedly born. The prosecution objected, but Judge Harlan allowed it, perhaps out of curiosity. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Elena Brooks, approached the stand, her hands shaking with nervousness. She explained that she had worked in the maternity ward for over 20 years. "I remember young Jamal Hale," she said, glancing at him sympathetically. "He was born under complicated circumstances." A hush swept over this courtroom as she recounted how Jamal's mother had arrived in the ER after a car accident. She was in labor and the father, known only to hospital staff as John Doe, had rushed in, demanding privacy for the birth. The nurse's face tinged pink. "We found it odd that he refused to give his real name or sign the documents. He vanished hours after the baby was delivered, leaving the mother behind. When we tried to follow up, the father's contact information was fake." Judge Harlan frowned, peering at the nurse over his spectacles. "And what does this have to do with the current case?" Cruz stepped forward. "Your Honor, part of the reason the defendant never came forward with certain details of his past is because those details were buried. This nurse's testimony confirms that Jamal's father went to great lengths to conceal his identity. We believe it ties into a pattern of suspicion that has followed Jamal his entire life. A suspicion that in part led to this wrongful accusation." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The revelation wasn't explosive in the sense of a direct link to the robbery, but it illuminated a world of secrecy around Jamal's origins. The prosecution, visibly irritated, pressed the nurse on how any of this proved Jamal's innocence. She admitted it didn't directly, but that an important truth was being unveiled. At the bench, Judge Harlan's face turned red. "Unless you can draw a direct connection between this father's secrecy and the alleged robbery, I see no reason to continue down this path, Mr. Cruz." His tone was clipped, but a layer of unease lurked beneath his gruff demeanor. Cruz bowed his head. "Your Honor, we have more evidence to present on this matter. I request a brief recess to organize it." Judge Harlan exhaled sharply. 15 minutes. As soon as the recess was called, the courtroom erupted in whispers. A sense of anticipation buzzed in the air like static electricity before a thunderstorm. In the hallway, Isaiah Cruz motioned Jamal aside. "You need to tell me everything," he said firmly, handing the nurse's documents back to him. "No more half measures, Jamal. If there's something about your father, anything that could show a pattern of you being misidentified or how your father's past led to false assumptions about you, now is the time to spill it, Bill. Jamal's shoulders sagged as he finally relented. In a low voice, he revealed that his father was, in fact, a man once embroiled in a high-stakes scandal that involved a wealthy businessman's accidental death. Fearing retribution from powerful people, he fled, taking on a new identity. I don't even know if he's alive anymore, Jamal confessed. I was just a baby. But the rumor in my family was that my dad never wanted me to be tracked or found by those people who blamed him for that accident. Cruz's eyes widened. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. That might explain why you've had so little record. Your father made sure to keep you off the radar. But how can we use this? Jamal shrugged helplessly. I don't know. I just can't go back and find him. He was gone. Left me with my grandmother. I was raised in a cloak of secrecy I never asked for. Cruz nodded, an idea forming. Maybe we don't need to find him. Maybe we just need to demonstrate that since childhood, you've been burdened by assumptions and shadowy threats. It might paint a clearer picture that you had no need to break into a store. You've been trying to keep your head down your entire life. They returned to the courtroom, hearts pounding, ready to expose more about Jamal's past than either had ever anticipated. Court resumed, and Cruz introduced a final piece of evidence, a sworn affidavit from Jamal's grandmother, detailing how she had once received threats from unknown individuals demanding to know the whereabouts of Jamal's father. The affidavit included notes of phone calls and intimidation that occurred when Jamal was a small child. Though it didn't directly speak to the robbery, it did show that Jamal's household had been subjected to external pressure. The prosecution objected again, but Judge Harlan allowed it with visible frustration. The judge's patience was wearing thin, and his face mirrored a mixture of annoyance and discomfort. He tapped his gavel. Mr. Cruz, you may proceed, but I warn you, keep this relevant. Cruz pressed on. We're showing that Jamal Hale had every reason to avoid any criminal activity that would draw attention to him. Given his family's history and the attempts to remain inconspicuous, it is illogical he would commit such a blatant robbery. Moreover, the evidence tying him to the crime is largely circumstantial. Assistant State's Attorney Lena Vargas took the floor, her eyes flashing with indignation. This is a courtroom, not a daytime soap opera. The facts remain. Jamal's partial fingerprint is at the scene, and we have witnesses placing him near the store. The details of his father's past are a red herring. Cruz was about to respond when an unexpected voice echoed through the chamber. Perhaps I can shed some light on Jamal's father. All eyes turned to the back of the courtroom. There, an older man in a faded trench coat stood shakily. He had deep-set eyes, a thin frame, and graying hair. Jamal's grandmother gasped from the gallery. Jamal's heart nearly seized in his chest. Judge Harlan rubbed his temples. Identify yourself. The man cleared his throat. My name is Darius Hale. I am the father of Jamal Hale. A collective gasp swept the courtroom. Cruz nearly dropped his papers. Jamal stared, torn between shock, anger, and a flicker of hope. The father he had never known was suddenly there, standing inches away from the police officers guarding the entrance. Assistant State's Attorney Vargas stepped forward. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We don't even know who this man really is. He could be an imposter. Darius stepped slowly down the aisle, producing documents. I have proof of my identity, including a birth certificate for Jamal. I realize this is abrupt, but I've come to rectify some misunderstandings. Judge Harlan's face was stormy with impatience. This had better be relevant to the case, Mr. Hale. Proceed carefully. The clerk examined Darius's documents, nodding to confirm their legitimacy. The older man's voice quivered as he spoke. I left Chicago years ago because I was accused of manslaughter in an accident that was not my fault. Powerful people tried to pin the blame on me. I changed my name, fled for my life, and I abandoned my son. I regret it every day. He turned to Jamal, who stared at him with wide, teary eyes. I'm so sorry, son. I didn't know how to protect you otherwise. The words hung in the silent courtroom. Assistant State's Attorney Vargas, not one to back down, asked sharply, And how does this relate to the burglary Jamal is accused of? Darius faced her. My son wouldn't do such a thing. For years, I paid private detectives to keep tabs on him from afar. I know for a fact that on the night in question, he was on a shift at the grocery store until closing because I have the time-stamped surveillance from the grocery store's back exit. I obtained it to keep track of his well-being. He handed over a USB drive. Cruz quickly took it, stunned. This shows the store's employee entrance where Jamal left that night? Yes, Darius confirmed, his voice trembling. Its date and time-stamped, matching the alleged robbery timeline. I only obtained it after the trial started when I heard Jamal was in trouble. I was too afraid to come forward due to my own fugitive status, but I can't let my son suffer. The court erupted in uproar. Judge Harlan glared at Darius. You realize you can be arrested for your past crimes if they are still prosecutable? Darius bowed his head. I accept that, but my son is innocent. The revelation that Jamal's father had returned, armed with possibly exonerating footage, upended the trial. During an emergency evidentiary hearing, the grocery store's manager confirmed that the footage looked authentic and that the employee entrance camera was operational at the time in question. Indeed, it showed Jamal clocking out just minutes before the burglary was reported, then lingering by the manager's office for several additional minutes to discuss scheduling. The timeline rendered it impossible for Jamal to be at the electronics store the moment it was broken into. A hush fell across the courtroom as the new evidence played on the projector. The prosecution looked visibly unsettled. Cruz allowed the footage to loop again, highlighting the digital timestamp. The once murky scenario now took on a stark clarity. Jamal was indeed nowhere near the scene at the crucial time. Judge Harlan shifted uncomfortably on the bench. His gaze flickered from the footage to Jamal, then to the father, who stood at the edge of the room guarded by two officers. The judge cleared his throat. In light of this new evidence, the state may wish to reevaluate its case. Assistant State's Attorney Vargas requested a moment with her team. She returned, wearing a tight-lipped expression. The state moves to dismiss the charges, Your Honor. Relief spread across Jamal's face. Tears trickled down his cheeks as he hugged Cruz, who clapped him on the back. In the gallery, Jamal's grandmother sobbed into Reverend Phelps' shoulder, repeating words of gratitude. Even some of the jury members who had been leaning toward a conviction looked shocked to realize how close they had come to condemning an innocent teen. Though the immediate threat to Jamal's freedom seemed resolved, a new wave of tension swept the courtroom. Judge Harlan still loomed over the proceedings, and his stoic demeanor cracked, revealing a deep-seated anger. Was it directed at Darius for derailing the carefully curated evidence, or perhaps at the entire situation that exposed a glaring near miscarriage of justice? In a measured tone, Judge Harlan nodded toward Jamal's father. Mr. Hale, you may have saved your son, but you have unresolved legal matters of your own. Officers, please take Mr. Hale into custody for further questioning on his outstanding charges. The bailiff stepped forward, leading a resigned Darius away in handcuffs. Before he disappeared through the side door, he glanced back at Jamal, his gaze filled with a complicated blend of sorrow and relief. An uneasy silence followed. Judge Harlan, realizing the intense scrutiny upon him, declared a brief recess. He exited in a rush, his robes billowing like a thundercloud trailing behind him. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Jamal, his grandmother, and Isaiah Cruz. Civil rights advocates lauded the turn of events as a victory against the systemic bias that nearly imprisoned an innocent black teen. The Innocence Project and NAACP representatives called for a formal review of Judge Harlan's history of sentencing. Rumors spread that the judge's track record of disproportionately harsh rulings against young black defendants might come under renewed inspection. In the days that followed, a formal complaint was lodged, spearheaded by the Innocence Project. They cited Jamal Hale's case as an example of Judge Harlan's prejudicial approach, pointing out how he had almost railroaded Jamal with minimal evidence. The media picked up the story, and soon enough, skeletons from Harlan's past spilled out. Questionable remarks he'd made about cleaning up the streets, lengths of sentences that were double the average for similar crimes, and the personal vendetta he allegedly carried since his own child's mugging. It didn't take long for the Judicial Review Board to open an investigation. Every step of it was broadcast widely, fueling public outrage. Harlan, once revered for his tough-on-crime stance, now found himself in the eye of a storm. Protesters began gathering outside the Cook County Courthouse, demanding his resignation. Jamal returned home to his grandmother's apartment, greeted by teary neighbors and family friends. A wave of relief coursed through him, but also an undertow of sadness for his father. Darius faced charges related to the old scandal, though there was talk of new evidence that might exonerate him too. He claimed to have proof that the accident he was involved in was not his fault. Jamal felt torn. Grateful for his father's sacrifice, resentful that he'd left them for so long, and hopeful that maybe they could rebuild something now. Reverend Phelps helped coordinate the best legal counsel for Darius, while Isaiah Cruz handled the media frenzy. In an unexpected turn, an outpouring of support streamed in from communities around Chicago. The Hale family found themselves at the center of a public debate on criminal justice reform. Calls for transparency in the legal system grew louder, with many citing Jamal's ordeal as a quintessential example of how easily a life can be derailed. Meanwhile, Judge Harlan, under intense scrutiny, publicly lashed out at what he called a coordinated smear campaign. He insisted he was not racist or biased, maintaining that he had acted in accordance with the law, but each day brought new revelations, old cases in which Harlan had ignored exculpatory evidence or had refused to allow certain pieces of testimony that might have freed defendants. The mounting pressure reached a boiling point when an official from the Judicial Conduct Commission hinted that Harlan might face suspension or worse, removal from the bench. In the weeks that followed, a disciplinary hearing convened to review allegations against Judge Harlan. It was not a criminal trial, but the outcome could mean the end of Harlan's judicial career. A panel of judicial peers along with public representatives examined evidence of biased rulings. Several individuals who had been prosecuted under Harlan's watch recounted their experiences, describing how they felt the judge had predetermined their guilt. Others cited instances where Harlan's decisions bordered on unethical, such as refusing to allow relevant witnesses to testify or making derogatory comments about defendants' backgrounds. Isaiah Cruz was called to testify about Jamal's case. He recounted Harlan's dismissive attitude and how the judge seemed to side with the prosecution even when the evidence was thin. Cruz explained that if Jamal's father had not appeared with the exonerating footage, Jamal might still be in a cell, labeled a criminal for life. By the time the hearing concluded, public outcry soared. Social media buzzed with hashtags demanding accountability. Under the weight of mounting evidence and public pressure, the panel made its recommendation. Judge Harlan was to be suspended, pending a final review that could strip him of his judgeship entirely. This was the hard karma many had predicted, the downfall of a once feared judge, brought on by his own unwillingness to treat defendants fairly. Jamal felt an odd mix of vindication and sorrow. While it was true that Harlan had nearly ruined his life, Jamal also recognized the tragedy that a man entrusted to uphold justice had lost his way so profoundly. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of relief knowing that fewer young people would experience the same prejudice he had. Life took on a new shape for Jamal. He met with Darius twice a week in a holding facility, forging the beginnings of a long-delayed bond. Darius apologized again and again, tears glistening in his eyes as he explained the reasons for his disappearance. Jamal's grandmother stood by quietly, forgiving her son, hoping for a new chapter of healing. The community rallied around Jamal, gifting him with scholarship funds and letters of support for college. Local newspapers championed his resilience and collaborative spirit. He resumed volunteering at the community center, often sharing his story with younger kids. He wanted them to know that sometimes the system might try to break you, but there are people willing to help you fight back. As for Judge Victor Harlan, the swirl of scandal intensified. More complaints surfaced from attorneys and defendants who felt wronged by his rulings. Investigations began into whether he had ever accepted monetary incentives, though no conclusive evidence emerged. Still, it was enough to keep the public eye on him. Disgraced and embittered, Harlan gave an exclusive interview to a local station attempting to salvage his image. His words fell flat, overshadowed by the avalanche of testimony against him. In the end, the final review board removed him from the bench, citing gross negligence and patterns of racial bias. Harlan left the courthouse one last time with his belongings in a cardboard box, his head hung low. The press snapped photos relentlessly, capturing every inch of his downfall. The once feared judge was now a symbol of injustice, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is unchecked. As the months passed, Jamal visited the Cook County Courthouse, this time not as a defendant but as a visitor. He was there to support a friend's legal case, offering moral support. Walking through those halls felt surreal, bringing back memories of shackles and stares and dread. But now a sense of peace accompanied him. He passed by the newly hung plaque in the main lobby, an homage to those who overcame wrongful accusations. A local philanthropic group had funded it, referencing the Innocence Project and the NAACP's critical roles in exonerating the wrongly accused. Jamal paused in front of the plaque, reading the small inscription, "Justice demands vigilance, and only by uniting do we ensure it for all." The words resonated deeply with him, reminding him that justice is a collective effort, something that requires everyone to play their part. Outside, the sky was bright, the winter chill replaced by the soft warmth of an early spring breeze. Jamal took a deep breath, glancing at the spot where the media had once surrounded him like vultures. It was quieter now, peaceful. Life moved on. Heading home, Jamal reflected on how a single moment, a single stroke of fate could alter a life's trajectory. He thought about Judge Harlan, who'd once towered over him, deciding his fate with a cold detachment, and how that same judge had been struck down by karma in the end. He considered the father he'd lost and found, the father who'd risked his own freedom to save his son from a miscarriage of justice. Above all, he felt gratitude for Isaiah Cruz's relentless pursuit of truth, for Reverend Phelps' unwavering support, and for every person who had stood by him when he was at his lowest. He also felt a stirring within himself, a desire to use his ordeal as a catalyst for change. Perhaps he'd go to law school, become an advocate for kids like him. Or maybe he'd work with a non-profit organization focused on prison reform. Whatever path he chose, he knew one thing for sure. His own story proved that hope can spark even in the darkest corners, and that the fight for justice, though fraught, was a worthy endeavor. Over the course of the following year, Darius finally had his day in court to face the old charges. Isaiah Cruz aided in his defense, presenting evidence that the fatal accident from years ago had been orchestrated by unscrupulous business associates. While the case was complex, enough holes were punched in the prosecution's argument to warrant a more lenient approach. Ultimately, Darius accepted a plea deal for lesser charges tied to fleeing the scene, but was released soon after thanks to time served and mitigating circumstances. Walking out of the courthouse together, father and son embraced. Though still fragile and uncertain, their bond was a chance to heal old wounds. In that embrace, Jamal felt the final pieces of his childhood heartbreak reassembling into something new and hopeful. Judge Harlan was long gone from the public eye, rumored to have sold his home, and moved out of state to avoid constant reminders of his downfall. Media headlines occasionally referenced his case as a turning point in local justice reform. Over time, the collective memory of the fiasco would fade, replaced by new scandals or triumphs. But for Jamal Hale, the lessons learned would remain forever etched into his soul. In a city like Chicago, where towering skyscrapers and glittering lights often contrast with grit and struggle, Jamal's story stood out, a beacon for those who believed in second chances and the power of truth. He was just one young man caught in the crosshairs of injustice, but his willingness to fight back, aided by good people, triggered a domino effect, toppling an unjust judge, revitalizing calls for legal reform, and unearthing the father he never truly knew. In the end, the message was clear. No matter how dark the night, a spark of truth can illuminate the path. Sometimes that spark takes the form of a father returning in a moment of dire need. Sometimes it's a lawyer who refuses to give up, and sometimes it's karma itself ensuring that those who abuse power cannot escape its reckoning forever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey where a young man fought against staggering odds and emerged stronger than ever. Jamal Hale's story reminds us that when darkness threatens to overshadow innocence, truth has an unstoppable way of finding its light. We saw how a judge's bias nearly destroyed a life only to be undone by the very justice he was sworn to uphold. We saw how a father's hidden past turned out to be the key that saved his son, bringing an unexpected reunion. Most of all, we learned how courage, faith, and unity can topple even the mightiest walls of injustice. If this story moved you, stirred your heart, or made you believe in the resilience of the human spirit, please show your support. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to stay inspired by more true-to-life tales of hope, perseverance, and redemption. Your voice matters. Join us in spreading the message that justice, though sometimes delayed, will always find its way.